All right. Welcome everyone in the house. This is your host, ETM Apologetics, along with Christian Apologetics Network, every Saturday live. And I always start with this Psalms 118, verse 24. It says, "This is the day that the Lord has made. We'll rejoice and be glad in it."
118 verse 4 says, "This
So,
is the day that the Lord has made.
we,
We'll rejoice and be
someone
glad in
is,
it." 4
I
says,
can't
"This
hear.
is the day that the Lord has made. We'll rejoice and be glad in it." 4
I
says,
can't
"This
hear.
is the day that the Lord has made. We'll rejoice and be glad in it."
Is it you, Ray? Let's see.
Yeah, one sec.
Okay. Yes. So this is the day that the Lord has made. We'll rejoice and be glad in it. Now we're here for another live stream when we talk about the series of the preservation of the Quran, as we're still gonna put it into test. So we started this series last year in December's time, if I'm not mistaken. And now we're almost done. Now we in one of the six Quranic manuscripts, and which is the Sana'a Polimsest. Okay, last week we had Sister had some touch with us, which was very beneficial. Hope that you guys were edified. Surprising, we had like 200 something views for Hatem Tash, so people were very interesting hearing what she had to say. And now we have today our brother Ray with us, who is a supporter to this group, a supporter to this team, and he is there willing to offer voluntarily on one of the six Quranic manuscripts, the Sinai Palimpsest. And before we have Ray on to share screen and present, we're gonna have a word of prayer. Dear Lord, we give you thanks for your grace. Thank you for your mercy, for what you have done, what you will continue to do on our behalf, as we are in this day to be able to come across to evangelize, share the message, the gospel, and also in apologetics to be able to give a defense and also polemics in which we are to be able to challenge other worldviews based on their belief system and based on their presuppositions. I ask the Lord, as my brother Ray is going to do a presentation on the Sinai manuscript, be with him, help us to be able to learn, to examine, not with blind faith, but to be able to examine truthfully whether the claim of the Muslims is truthful. Be with us, guide us, hold us into your presence, and help us to remember that Christ should always be the center of our ministry evangelism. Not to do it with ego, not to do it with boastful or with pride, but with humility that we want our Muslim friends to be saved. Guide us and use Brother Ray in his ministry as he's gonna lead us and also in his ministry reaching out to atheists and Muslims. Be with him in Jesus' name, I pray. Amen. All right, so Brother Ray is on the front line, our biggest supporter. We thank you for that, Brother Ray. And you're welcome. And the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Buji. Welcome everyone, and hi to everybody of Christian Apologetics Network. So, a very, very interesting topic, and many probably wouldn't even have a clue what is a Sana Palimpsest manuscript. It's a very unusual, very rare, very unique manuscript, but one of great significance. So definitely deserves some time, and we're going to give it some time today because we're going to go through and just unpack what this is and ultimately what does it all mean and what are the implications based on what has been discovered. So I'll have a presentation, so I'm going to just share my slides. There we go. Cool. So we're going to go through these slides, and this is really going to be very, very enlightening. So, as I say, we're going to discover what this is, and then we're going to look at the implications based on that, because it's certainly very significant indeed. And a word of warning here, as we always will do, we're here to, as Woodgie mentioned in his prayer, here to present truth. We want to be honest and open. Now, what the warning would be is to go and ask a Muslim about it, because this is not something that works in their favor. It's not something they really will ever promote. And therefore, when you do speak to them, they may not give you an honest answer, because they will probably come up with some excuse to say, oh, this is nothing, it's whatever. But we will see that is absolutely not the case. It is definitely very, very significant. And the main reason why it's ultimately very significant, we'll put this as the outset, is that the Quran and many Muslims support this point, that the Quran is perfectly preserved, word for word, letter for letter, etc. And therefore there are no deviations, no changes, no variations, no contradictions, etc., etc. And that's particularly why this is significant, because if we find out that that claim is not true, that really does challenge whether the Quran is true and whether it's from God, because the Muslims also claim that the Quran is verbatim the word of God. So it's not some interpretation. It's not something that got translated. It's actually God's word. So if the God says, so they claim that it's perfectly preserved, then we should have no reason to find any reason for it not to be. So this is why the Sana'a Polimsest manuscript is very, very important amongst others. So let's get into the detail. So in my slides here, hopefully you can see them enough. Are they large enough, would you think? You know, if you can increase the size or...
Yes, they're a bit large.
Okay.
You can see now.
Yeah, good. So what we've got here at the top, we've got giving you a bit of an insight on what the Sana'a manuscript is. When you look at it from just a manuscript, it's just obviously it's going to be it's a very old manuscript, so it's going to look very, very worn, and all you see is writing on it. And you say, well, it looks ordinary to you and I, just a manuscript that's very old. It's obviously got signs of being very dated and worn and what have you, but that's on the naked eye. That's what all you and I would see if we saw this manuscript. This is obviously in a museum and protected. So that's what we would see if we went to come and have a look at it. So what's you see on the right, which is the one in the middle, is where an ultraviolet light has been shown on this manuscript. And look at the difference. And of course, this is done where with no light. The ultraviolet is a non-visible light to the naked eye. But it provides a light that goes, a ray that goes onto the manuscript, and look at the difference. Then when that's converted into an image, this is the image you get. And as you can see here, the dark blue lines are what is the text that you would have seen on the left. That's your standard text. But what you've got below, which is like behind the text, is this very light blue text. And what that basically is, and this is what the Palimpsest manuscript is, it's a document, a parchment, if you like, that was originally written down with whatever the wording was. And then this was then, and there'd be reasons for it, it would have been removed, washed away, or attempted to be washed or removed, a bit like what we do with a rubber, with a pencil, we'd rub it away, wash it away, so it could be reused. And then much later on in this case, it was reused, but unknown to most people, they didn't realize that what was washed away wasn't fully washed away. There still was a very, very slight remains if you like, of some kind of impression still remaining on the parchment. And that's what this ultraviolet light is showing. It's somehow, with very clever technology, it was able to find that there was actually an original text that sits behind the later text, and it's actually, as you can see to the right, then you can see what that image is. So this is where it then takes the back image, which was the original image, and then, if you like, extracts that from the top layer image, and then you can actually be able to read and decipher what the wording is on that original text. And that is where it absolutely gets interesting. So this was discovered in 1972 in Yemen, and this lady here, Asma Halali, was the first one that wrote a book as an expert on this particular manuscript, and she looked in detail as an expert into both what we call the upper and lower text. So what we're going to do here is we're going to very simply, to start with, show you and make the comparisons between the upper and lower text. Why this is important, as you now can start to see, that this is no ordinary text. It's not like a little diary or a recipe or whatever. It's actually the manuscript of the Quran. So both the lower level text is a manuscript of the Quran, and the upper layer is also a manuscript of the Quran. So, and it's taken, interestingly, which is where I think it gets particularly interesting, is the lower text is then compared to the Uthmanic text. So just to be clear here, the Uthmanic text is not necessarily the upper text, because obviously the upper text isn't necessarily going to be the precise same surah and ayahs of the lower text. So what they do is they've taken the lower text and they've compared it to what they call the Uthmanic standardized text. So a little bit of history, as you probably know in the previous episodes. Uthman, because through the different caliphs and what have you, there were concerns about the authenticity and reliability of the Quran. A lot of people that memorized it were killed in battle. As much as I have some concerns about this reliability of this oral tradition, because when we see written text, they're not as accurate. If the oral tradition was so good, it caused definitely some issues, because what we did see is prior to Uthman, there was lots of different texts, some verses missing, some with a greater more chapters than 11. So there were some differences already established. And Uthman basically was the one that standardized the Quran. So this is what we're seeing here, is what they believe is the standardized Quran. Of course, Muslims will give you a different story and how that came about, but ultimately, that is what they say is the original Quran, the perfect Quran. So we can use that as a standard, if you like, to compare. And that's what we're doing here. So we're comparing that standardized text of Uthman against what was the lower text of the Palimpsest manuscript. So here's some examples. Surah 2196, and the wording there is, "And I do not shave your head," whereas in the lower text it says, "I do not cut your hair." So not a significant difference in the meaning, but it's clearly a different sentence using different Arabic words. Surah 2, verse 222, "Until they are pure," and the other one says, "Until they have washed." Now, that is a bit more significant, because just saying somebody's been washed is very different to saying somebody that they are pure. That's a lot more significant and has definitely a very different degree of meaning behind it. Surah 9107, "And those who took a mosque for harm, and those who took a mosque for hypocrisy." So harm and hypocrisy is not the same. It could be related, of course, but it's clearly not the same. The meaning is not the same, and there are different connotations to each of those different words. Surah 21:9-1, Uthman says in his manuscript, and she who guarded her chastity, and the lower text says, and she guarded her womb. So again, they're different Arabic words there. You got to mention there on the side, from Fajaha to Rahimaha, and apologies for my pronunciations, but more importantly, the point being they are different Arabic words. Similar, related, absolutely, but not the same. That's the key point. And Surah 63, verse 7, until they dispersed, and the other one is until they go away. Okay, that's very, very similar, but not the same word, but it's of a similar meaning because it comes from the same root word. So that gives you a flavor of what we're talking about here. Now, we'll be honest, we're not talking about significant differences, but that's not the key. The key point is they are differences. And if the Quran is saying it's perfectly preserved, as every scholar, Muslim scholar would agree, then this should not happen. This is why this particular manuscript is significant. So, give a bit of background now on these two layers. So, the upper layer was written, by the way, on the 8th century, and it conforms to that standardized Uthmanic text, even though obviously it would have been a different chapter, different surahs, but it would be related to the standardized Uthmanic text. And what's important there is why we then can make the comparison is if the upper text is based on the Uthmanic standardized text, then that's a valid text to view. And then, of course, when we look at the lower text, it's not in agreement with the Uthmanic text, hence why we're getting these differences. And this was, it says here, this was erased, dates are around the 7th century. So it's like a good, 50, 80 plus years or so difference. Not sure, obviously, when they do these tests on aging, they're not precise, of course, they're just a rough approximate. But clearly there is a 50 to 18 plus year difference. Questions about the lower text. Why was that lower text erased? That's definitely a very good question. Some thoughts were that it could have been that the text just simply was faded over time and therefore it was illegible, and therefore and of course back then paper or parchment or whatever they were using back then were not cheap. They're quite expensive, and therefore rather than use a brand new parchment, they would just reuse old ones for that reason. The text could have been simply inaccurate and it needed correcting. This is where it gets interesting, because why were these differences? Possibly the text was obsolete and needed updating. So, and then possibly the text was a kind of different form, if you like, and needed to be updated based on the upper text. But either way you look at it, there are variances. And then a summary was done. In total, there are 63 verses of where there is 70 variants. Now, this is where it's significant. If you think about it, 63 verses is a very small percentage. Let's, for argument's sake, it's around 1% of the Quran. Look how many variants we got. We've almost got one variant per verse. And if there are thousands of overall verses in the Quran, it would suggest there are thousands of variances from one form of manuscript to another. So, very interesting, isn't it? Indeed. And then we got here verbs, nouns, 25 times, where we've got variances. Isolated letters, the 29 letter variances, entire sentence variances, the 16 of those, and this is just in 63 verses. This is not what they call a scored text, because it is too early, and where is the original? So, and that's from that lady I mentioned who did a scholarly review of this. And then Dr. Elizabeth Puen. This is a what they call a nascent text with a different form. with corrections then were washed up and rewritten around 705 AD. So let's look at some specific examples here of what we're talking about. So this is where it gets even more interesting. In 2007, Benham Sajahi, this is all reference information. This is not made up. This is all sourced from reputable sites, sources. So all I'm doing here is just quoting these sources to you. This is nothing to do with my personal impression before anyone wants to start on that approach. This is purely me just outlining and demonstrating what evidence we do have available. And of course, that means you can search these things up and look at them up yourself. Sana'a 1MS as an example. As I said, Benham Saji and Uwe Bergman published RC14 dating of a single folio at the AMS laboratory, which dated it 578 to 669 and claimed it was produced no more than 15 years after the Prophet's death. 2015, a Christian Robin tested the same Sana'a manuscript at the Lyon lab, but he dated it 388 to 643. Now that's extremely interesting because now it gets very interesting. You're going to see why in a second. If these dates are potentially accurate, I'm not going to make a big point of this because the fact is arranged, of course, and a Muslim response will be, well, it's even because it's within the range of Muhammad's life, it's fine. But there is a possibility that these manuscripts were actually written before Muhammad, because obviously 388 is before manuscript received. Not that, and this is important, but not before Muhammad's life, before Muhammad claimed to receive the revelation. And that's where this is very, very interesting. So how's that possible? Which again suggests where is the source of the manuscript of the so-called revelation? Was it really truly revelation in the first place? All these questions then become interesting, don't they? So the physical and paleographic details. And the material was written on, as I said, a parchment made from animal skins. And that was over 200 animals were needed for the original complex codex. So script layers utilized the Hijazi script and early form of the Arabic writing, characterized by slant irregular lines. So by the nature of the way that it's worded, it does indicate which type of script it is, or which type of Arabic writing. Now, what I mean by that is the Arabic writing itself went through a transition. Of course, initially it started, the original Arabic, of course, was without vowels and expressions. It was just very simply a bit like the Hebrew, original Hebrew. It's very similar to that. So it went through a transition, and this is at least by that transition. Of course, it also changes the style of the way it was written, because as you know, Arabic is as a kind of artistic, pictorial kind of language. The way it's written, it's not like letters the way we see it. It's just like symbols, if you like. But the style and form also changed over the years. So therefore, you can tell by the form when this was written. That gives you, again, a very good indication of when it was written. Tests conducted at the University of Arizona indicated that 95% of the parchment dates before 6620, potentially within 15 years of the Prophet Muhammad's death. The lower text is the only known surviving example of a non-Uthmanic Quran. Why is that interesting? Because as we know from history, and this is well recorded in Islamic quarters, if you like, is when Uthman standardized the Quran, he burnt every, or he thought, he claimed anyway, that he burnt every previous version, and that's what the standardized version was. He removed all the previous versions. So that, of course, prevents anybody doing any kind of critique on looking at those previous versions. So it was, if you like, in a way, He may have had a good reason for doing the standardization, but because he burnt the previous ones, it also took away any kind of validity of whether the Quran was perfectly preserved. Because if he hadn't burnt them and we could seize the prior manuscripts, we would see variations. And why we're confident of that is because this manuscript is clearly, by the style, the form, the way it was aged, clearly was written prior to Uthman when he standardized the Quran. So this one, if you like, escaped from the destruction of all the Qurans. And that was because this was found actually by accident. I don't know which property it was found in or where it was found. It was somewhere maybe in the attic or wherever it was found. And it was only found by accident. And by the age and by the style of writing, it was clearly prior to Uthman. And that's very, very important. And this is another little good note of information, is that the surah order, the chapters, do not follow based on the standard order of decreasing length. So again, there were some differences in how the chapters were structured. So that's a significant difference, isn't it? Phrasing. Variances exist at the level of the words and phrases. For example, in Surah 287, the lower text uses wa quafanya ala atharihi instead of the standard wa quafanaya min badihi. Not that this pronunciation is any good, apologies, but you can clearly see there are very, very different Arabic phrases being used between the lower text and the standardized text. Bismillah in the lower text, Surah 9 at Tawbah reportedly includes Bismillah, which is absent in the standardized version, along with a note saying, do not say in the name of God. Now that is a very significant difference for Bismillah to be said in the lower text, but in the standard text, it's missing. So some scholarly interpretations. Let's get some scholars involved. So as I said, like Benham Sajihi, Mohsen Godzawazi, and Asma Kalali, which is the one that we talked about at the very beginning, have proposed several theories regarding its origin. The codex, it may represent a private codex belonging to a companion of the Prophet, such as Ibn Masud or Ibn B. Ka'b. Now, this is very important because we have seen on previous episodes here on this channel, and even on my channel as well, Ray for Truth, is that these individuals did have different versions of the Quran in their possession. We've got records of this. So certainly Ibn B. Ka'b was definitely one of them, which were later suppressed during Uthman's standardization. So interesting there, suppressed. A little bit different than being burnt. So, of course, that's basically, again, confirming that Uthman didn't burn every single Quran. He only burnt as much as he could, but he didn't buy more. Of course, these were probably Qurans that were in the personal possession of Ibn Masud and Ibn Ka'b. And therefore, again, we can use those to make certain comparisons, can't we? So the practice is that some scholars like Asmi Hilali suggest it might have been a student's practice notebook rather than a formal copy. That's a possibility, of course. But the interesting thing is when you've got a clear surah, you've got a clear ayah, why is that different to the standardized version? So scribal error. The variants are often considered minor, which I would agree in most parts, and do not significantly change the core message or theology of the text. They are frequently attributed to scribal slips or semi-oral transmissions. Now, that's a fair point, and I will give that some validity that to some degree is okay. We saw comparisons where those variances were minor. I would say they're not significant, but nevertheless, they are differences using different Arabic words. And why that is significant in the full sense of the word is based on what the Quran itself is claiming. If that is Allah's words and Allah is saying that his word is perfectly preserved, you wouldn't even expect to find this level of variance. That's the point. Especially when they say that the old edition was perfectly preserved and so on and so on. Again, the claim in the Quran is saying it's perfectly preserved. You definitely wouldn't get variances then, would you? Even if they are relatively insignificant. So to understand the significance of the Sana'a Polimsest, we must look at the lower text. While most of the differences are synonymous, using different words for the same meaning or similar meaning, I would say, they provide a rare window into the fluid state of the text before the standardization. And that's the important bit here. Before Uthman standardized the text, there were clearly a level of variation. Why is that? That certainly begs the question, doesn't it? Oops, see if I can come out of there. There we go. So some key observations on these variances. Most variances involve using a synonym that does not change the theological meaning. I would agree with that. For example, shave and cut, obviously very similar. Scribal omissions and additions. In some verses, the lower text includes small bridging words that are absent in the Uthmanic text, like and, the, etc. The Bismillah in one text, the word Bismillah in Surah 9, one of the most famous discrepancies, begins with Basmala in the lower text. In the standard text, this simply does not exist. So that's a little bit, I would say, more significant. Regional traditions. Some of the variances are found in the Sana'a Polimsest match descriptions in early Islamic literature of the codices belonging to companions. So there were variances that were held by various companions, and then you've got to ask yourself, for something that's perfectly preserved, why do we have those variances? Hence the question, why did the text change? The prevailing scholars' view that it was during the very early period the Quran was transmitted in several dialects and readings. Now, I covered this in extensively, by the way, on my channel. I don't know if I did it on this one as well. But let's get an understanding what this is talking about here. So these dialects and roofs, there were like 7 different forms, if you like, of this aruf or differences, which is said a different recitation. But the transmissions are not simply a case of a different recitation, as in it's a different pronunciation dialect issue. We have different Arabic words which have different Arabic meanings. So that's not the case that we're talking about. And there'll be cases where it is, absolutely. But we're showing you cases where it's actually different Arabic words. They may be even similar. In some cases, they're not. Where one says you do something and the other says I do something. Those are cases where the variances are significant. Not so much in this palimpsest, but still it is demonstrating variances, and that's the important part. The Uthmanic project sought to unify the Muslim community with a single written text. The lower Sana'a lower text likely represents one of the non-standard versions that got washed away so the parchment could be reused. But the underlying point is it's significant, isn't it? What we're finding out that this lower text contained. Beyond individual verses, the order of the chapters in this palimpsest is notably different, and the standard Quran surahs are generally arranged from longest to shortest. So it was all a different structure, if you like. And not, so Surah 1 wouldn't be Surah 1 necessarily. They'd be in a slightly different order. Obviously, you'd have to find one surah that could be much earlier in the Quran versus one that's a bit later, be in the same chapter, but they just were in different orders. So that's another thing that was discovered because of this particular manuscript. Surah 19 is followed by Surah 9 as an example, then Surah 12 is then followed by Surah 18. You can see they're not directly in order to the standardized version. Surah 15 was then followed by Surah 25. So if it was perfectly preserved, why would we have a very different order? So you can see why there were some challenges in the way that the Quran was compiled. That would be the main takeaway from that, I would say. So the scientific methods used to recover this text so is a major feat because it used, because back then it was very washed away. It used ink that's over 1,300 years old. So what did they do? First of all, they used the ultraviolet fluorescent light. This was primarily the method by scholars like Jared R. Puin in the 1980s, and later with Benham Zajahi. The science of parchments and ink reacted differently to UV light, hence why you can then make the distinction. And while the ink was washed away, chemical traces, residue was remaining on the parchment, and that was enough for the light to pick it up. The result was that the parchment fluorescent light, while the residual minerals from the old ink absorb the light, this makes the erased lower text appear as a faint, dark, ghost-like script, which was, with then furthermore technology, here we go to step 2, if you like, the multispectral imaging. Technology advanced researchers beyond from ultraviolet light, which is now the gold standard for palimpsest recovery today. The process, the manuscript photographed multi times under different wavelengths of light, ranging from ultraviolet all the way to visible spectrums of infrared, etc. Digital subtraction. Using software, scientists could then subtract the upper text from the lower text, and using a different chemical composition of thickness, it reacts differently to infrared, etc., comparing the lower text from the upper text. And that's how they could isolate the difference. And then thirdly, the X-ray fluorescence, XRF, was also used to identify composition of the inks without touching the manuscript at all, which is quite good. Identifying the type of ink it was. So this confirmed that the method the lower text was written was iron gal ink, and over time the iron in the ink reacts with the parchments, creating a burned-in signature that remains even if pigmentation was scrubbed off. So that's interesting, isn't it? The actual ink that was used during that time was a very ink that really did force its way into the parchment at a much stronger level, which is why even when you wash it away, it was able to still be recovered, and there was still some embedded access to the wording that was on the parchment. The copper-iron ratio. By analyzing the metallic traces elements, researchers could sometimes determine if different scribes worked on different sections of the manuscript. So they could even determine the type of manuscript, the type of form, style, and of course, if it changes, then there's a good chance it's a different scribe, if you like, that was working on your manuscript. So that's how incredibly detailed it is. That's how professionally scientific it is. So this is not something that can be easily discarded or ignored. The science and the quality of the science and the kind of technology being used is so sophisticated that it's a very, very accurate way of proving there was this lower text and this upper text. Now that's the key point. It wasn't just some approximation, a rough view, or a poor assessment. It was a very highly sophisticated technical assessment of the parchment. Challenges in the recovery. Now, despite all the technologies, it still was very difficult to read the difference. The reason being is the Hijazi text of the upper text sits sometimes directly on top of, making it therefore difficult to visibly see the difference. Some parchment damage, of course, the washing of the parchment in the 8th century involved acidity and abrasion, which weakened the calf skin, making it very difficult for even natural light to reflect on it. Incomplete cleaning in some spots. The original scribes did wash the text perfectly. In other areas, they scrubbed so hard that the shadow of the text was physically destroyed. So depending on how extensive the cleaning was, there were areas of the lower text that was completely removed, but fortunately there was enough that wasn't cleaned or washed away completely to allow to recover some degree of that lower text. Sajahazi Gudrazi Digital Reconstruction in 2012, scholars him and Mohsen Gudrazi published a landmark study. They utilized this high-resolution UV images and produced a full transcript of that lower text. They use this digital enhancement to increase the contrast of that what we call ghost script, allowing it to identify exactly what was written and therefore be able to provide very clear details on identifying what those variances were. So that's the significance of the technology being used. In 72, there were heavy rains, and so a section of the ceiling of the Great Mosque of Sana'a collapsed. Workers found a paper grave of massive cache of parchment fragments tucked away in the inner rooms, not realizing their value, and they gathered them into potato sacks and left them on the mosque floor. So it wasn't until Qadi Ismail Akbar, then director of the UNAMI Antiquities Authority, realized that these had potential importance, and of to find that the international help was sought. And this is when he got, in 1979, the German restoration team, led by Gerd Purin, as we spoke about earlier, who brought the organization team together and to preserve these fragments. The Atlantic Monthly controversy in 1999. The controversy exploded that in the mainstream, due to the article of What is the Quran, in this piece, Purin was also quoted suggesting that the Sana'a manuscript implied the Quran was an evolving text. This is where it starts getting significant, isn't it? Rather than just a fixed revelation. So if it was claimed it was a pure, perfect revelation, perfectly preserved, you wouldn't see this what we call evolving text, would we? And Gerd Purin also quotes here, my idea is that this kind of cocktail of texts that were not all understood even at the time of Muhammad. So again, this was basically showing that people back then really didn't understand what was the text, what they had in their hands and what they had preserved and so on. And this way that it was being transmitted clearly was showing that there were different transmissions using different words. The reaction, well, there was academic backlash. Well, many scholars felt that Purin's comments were sensationalized and premature, as the variants found did not change the core message of the Quran. There was a political fallout. Just give you a bit of history behind this. The Yemeni government felt embarrassed and betrayed. They felt that the researchers had used their access to promote a narrative to undermine the sanctity of the Quran. You see, it's just quite incredible, isn't it? So this is where Muslims, of course, they take a lot of pride in their Quran, and they really believe it to the word. Whatever's in the Quran, they believe it is 100% accurate. So when they see variances, they just can't accept them. So they have to, say, oh, this can't be true. They're making it up, whatever. But we're saying this is why we're putting the details in front of you. This was based on sophisticated research using higher level technology, absolutely proven without a doubt. The two different texts, the lower and the upper text, are clearly different. And as we can see, compared to the standardized Uthmanic text, which is what the upper text would be in agreement with, definitely doesn't agree with that lower text. Consequently, the Yemeni authorities became extremely protective. Access to this original DAM 01-287.1 parchment of the Palimpsest was then restricted for years. Scholars had to rely on a limited set of black and white photos taken by Purin. So initially, you just couldn't get your hands on this text at all. It only came much later that finally experts did get their hands on it, and then were able to do these very sophisticated tests to really be able to accurately extract the text. And as I said, the good thing is the ink that was used back then, and now with the sophisticated technology, the combination meant that they actually did get a very good rendition for a good degree of that text found on that parchment. So it's a very reliable, very accurate study and result, is the point made here. Hidden microfilm. So before access was restricted, Purin and his colleagues took thousands of rolls of microfilm of those fragments. So taking loads of pictures. For years, these were used only as a way for scholars were able to study the text. So of course, problem with that, of course, it's very difficult to use microfilm because the quality of taking pictures of a faint lower text wouldn't have been that accurate. But then in recent years, the atmosphere had shifted because of the concerns with this. The French-Italian mission, new teams were eventually allowed back in the house of the manuscripts in Sana'a. So that's why I call the Sana'a manuscripts, because they were found in a place called Sana'a. And the digital openness in 2012, again, Benjamin Sajighi and Muslim Ghazwari, these two guys again, both scholars, learned scholars, published their detailed study of the lower text. And this was seen a more objective, rigorous analysis of the early sensationalized reports. So initially it may have been, it was a bit sensationalized because it was just based on photos. And of course, anyone just taking standard photos of that text, the quality would not have been good. And I would have said would not have been substantial enough to substantiate any accuracy of what that text was. But as we know, once they started to use the technology of those ultraviolet rays and those other technologies, that changed everything. Asmali Halawi's work in 2017 published a transcription through Oxford Press suggesting that this text was not a competing Quran, but a teaching tool of notes, whatever. That's part of what is suggested here. But again, when you have surahs and you have, and this is what gets interesting, you have surahs and you have ayahs literally quoted in the lower text, matching the same surah and ayah of the standardized text. If that's just a note, why would you make a note of a particular verse? And what you're actually doing is you're writing the actual verse, because as we saw, the verses are very similar. So it's not really a note taken, I would say, but we have actual verses lined up, comparing like for like, where we just have variances. And the important point is what's causing those variances. If there is a perfect tradition, like they say, which can go back to the original, back to Muhammad, they have the perfect chain of narration, which they keep claiming. Perfectly preserved, perfectly memorized, perfect chain of narration. If you've got a perfect memorized Quran, you then write it down. There is no reason why you would have variances like we're talking about. Chapters in different places. In some cases, some Qurans have more chapters than other. Here in this Palimpsest manuscript, we have, what do we have? Different words. Now, I would agree for most parts, they're not significant. But the point is, it doesn't matter that much. Of course, if they were major difference, it would be more significant. But they're still significant because a perfectly preserved Quran shouldn't have any variances. And that's the point. Current status. Today, the primary concern is no longer the religious controversy, but physical survival. Since 2014, Yemen has been embroiled in a devastating civil war. The Daham Matutat in Sana'a, where the manuscripts were held, is located in a high-risk area. So while there has been reports that the manuscripts were safely stored in the basement vaults, the lack of international monitoring makes the current condition a source of great anxiety. So whether these will continue to be restored and continually protected, time will tell, because the wars that are going on. I don't know if that's still the latest now. That was the current state not too long ago. So let's look at some implications. Let's talk first of all, Surah 15, verse 9. The verse, indeed, it is we who send down the Quran, and indeed we will be its guardian. So again, if the guardian was well preserved, then there should not be any variations. Doesn't matter if they're small. It's the fact they are variations. They shouldn't be at all. That's the point. Surah 41:42. It cannot be proven false from any angle. It's a revelation from the one who is all wise. Does these variances result in actual different Arabic words which have different meanings? We see clearly, yes. Not significant in these cases. In the Palimpsest, we know in other manuscripts that we have discovered, where we even have today between Hafs and Wash and Duri Quran and how wherever it's pronounced, we do have major Arabic word differences. The Palimpsest doesn't have major ones, I will agree, but apart from Bismillah, which is missing in one in the latest version. The point being, we do have variances nevertheless. It says in 85 verse 21 that this glorious Quran was recorded in a preserved tablet. If the preserved was on a tablet with perfect oral tradition, again, I'm begging the question, why then the variant manuscripts? And then 6 verse 115 says, the word to your Lord has been perfected in truth and justice. No one, this is probably the most significant verse, I think, in the Quran. No one can change his words, and he is all hearing, all knowing. Now, let's just take a little bit of time on this. Perfect in truth, it's been perfected in truth, and this is the important bit. No one can change his words. So that means, if you think about it, if somebody attempted to try and change the Quran, they're going to fail. Because Allah, if it's true and good, and this is the true God, then he would find a way to prevent that change taking place. So we shouldn't see cases where we do have changes in the Quran. Now, even with Uthman trying to burn a lot of it, he didn't burn them all. We still have copies of other, and where it also clearly shows where it wasn't well preserved is even today, the Wash, the Jury, and Hafs Quran, to name a few of the many Qurans out there, they have different Arabic words. And the Palimpsest is definitely another case where we do see variances. Again, begging the question that how can that be possible if Allah himself is saying that no one can change his word, it's perfectly preserved? If that was the case and that was true, and that was from God, you wouldn't be seeing any of these type of changes at all, not even at this level, let alone any worse, of course. So that's where the implication is really significant, and why the Palimpsest again has a very important part to play, because it again is an authentic manuscript that was found, let's just for the argument's sake, to keep it simple, during the very early times of Muhammad, and therefore it's one of the very earliest manuscripts, and we have the proof of that because the style of the writing as well. The ink that was used was a very iron-based ink, which didn't stay being used for long because it wasn't a very good quality ink, but that's what they had at the time. So the style of writing, the ink, etc., the way that it was structured, all these literary styles, etc., all compiled together give you a very good assessment that this was a very old manuscript, very much closer to Muhammad's time, and therefore it is significant, because that was when, if you think about it, when you have, based on the claim, of course, Angel Gabriel was the one that received the word directly from God. So Muhammad didn't, by the way, receive the word directly from God. I'm sure most Muslims should know this. It went to the Angel Gabriel. It was Angel Gabriel in a cave that spoke to Muhammad. Muhammad then, they said they had very good oral tradition, so they memorized it by his companions. And once they've all memorized it, they have it very clear in their head what the Quran is. Then they just wrote it down. If that's all true, a very early manuscript should be a very good example of what was revealed. So why is it then, as we go further down the timeline, as we get further down, we start to see, especially at the time of Uthman and beyond, we see a version then that are very different to those earliest manuscripts. Why are we getting such variances? Again, other means from other manuscripts show different Qurans, more chapters, less chapters, certainly some verses missing, some verses added. We've got different words on specific surahs, and here in the Palimpsest, again, we are seeing variances between surahs and ayahs compared to the standardized version, again showing you there clearly are variances, maybe not to the such degree as in other cases, but at least it's also supporting a very clear case and evidence that this perfectly preserved Quran is simply not true. There are variances, and again, that's put the question of whether the Quran is truly from God. That's it. That's my completion of my presentation.
That's beautiful, beautiful. Um, some things that I've never really come across, learned from the Sun 9 manuscript, which is very informative and very thoughtful for that one. And that just shows that the Quran, there are textual variants in every sort of the manuscript, especially when it links back to Uthman and the Hadith, Sahih Bukhari, where he took all the manuscripts of the other companions of Muhammad and come together with Zayd and Tabit and burn the copies, the manuscripts. So now, even the question that you can judge for yourself, to Muslims, according to these manuscripts, is it does it really link back to Muhammad, or we have some discrepancies and variants in those manuscripts? Is it identical? One will say it's identical, but just for yourself, or to give us a source where the identical took place in every single dot for dot, letter for letter, word for word. So that's a beautiful presentation. Christian apologetics. Not if you have anything to add.
Yeah, thank you, Brother Will, for the wonderful presentation. I love the way you presented it, and looking at it from the scholarly perspective is very, very important, so that Muslims wouldn't say we are kind of being apologetical with the presentation. And so when you make a presentation based on the scholarly um, discoveries and the scenes of scholar, which is academia, then you know that these conclusions or these words are actually coming from an unbiased institution. So, like Brother Ray rightly said, he has said everything, but you must the scholarly conclusion about this manuscript is very, very important for Muslims, because when you are being told that you have a complete text being sent down, and that complete text that is being sent down is also the same time perfectly preserved and also eternal. And yet, when scholars look at this so-called text, like Brother Ray rightly pointed out, they say that they saw the Quran undergoing a kind of what I would call a kind of standardization. That is, it's kind of undergoing an improvement, like it's undergoing a kind of growth. They are trying to look at how fit is this one good or this one not good. Take for instance the Sana'a Polimsest that Brother Ray looked at today. The question still remain: why was the lower text? Why was it washed away? And when you date that manuscript, when you date it back, though this is still up for debate, but it is being dated to the 7th century, that is in the late 7th century. And when you look at the late 7th century, who were in power at that time? It was the Umayyad Empire, and it was Caliph Abdul Malik that was in power at that time. So this, and if you listen to people like Dr. J. Smith, he is of the position, and also I also agree with him that um, Islam actually began with Abdul Malik. And so when Islam began, they saw a need to have a text. And when they created the first text, then they see that there's a need for them that, okay, this text probably is not so complete, it has some errors, then they have to clean it. Would you clean up a text that is perfectly preserved? That's number one. Would you clean up a text that is complete? Would you clean up a text that is without errors? Those are the questions you should ask yourself. So this evidence of the Sana'a Polimsest, it actually destroys every claims that Muslims have concerning the Quran, because when you say your text is that the best form of preservation is via memory, so we will assume that the lower text of that Sana'a Polimsest was written down from memory. Of course, Then if it was written down from memory, then why did the memory fail and they had to wash it away? Then if you claim it is preserved, then why did the preservation fail? They have to wash it away. And then when you now compare the lower text with the upper text, then you have a different Quran entirely. Because when you if you think that what is being said is kind of wrong, why don't you produce that lower text of the Quran as a separate Quran, then produce the upper text of the Quran as a separate Quran, then distribute that text in different mosques and let people begin to recite that same text in different mosques and see if that mosque will not be burnt down by Muslims and saying you guys are reciting different Qurans. So you have a different Quran, so which means that it is not perfectly preserved. So like Brother Ray said, the Quran is actually undergoing standardization. So they actually still in the process of writing it. Even this is the conclusion of scholars, not my conclusion. You heard from Brother Ray himself when he brought out, I think, was it not Dr. Jarapuin or some of the scholars that concluded, but I know generally that every scholars conclude that the Quran was actually undergoing standardization from the 7th century up even to this time. There are still standardization being seen ongoing on the Quranic text. So
builders connection.
Can I just make a quick point on what the brother said there?
Yeah.
One thing that's also a nice takeaway, I think, quite good to think about, and all what the brother said there was very, very, very well put, very well explained. A nice way to summarize this was also that, and I would say this is a very valid point. If we
the bottom line is
on,
it is not preserved. Sir, you can go on, sir.
Yep. Okay. So here's another very interesting point based on the oral tradition. If you have, and this is what I would say be the case, you have a collection of people memorizing a book, and this is not a few pages. There's okay, it's not as big as a Bible, but it's still a fairly big book. It still has thousands of words, sentences in it, so it's a fairly large-sized book. Now, if we had 10 people in a room all memorizing that book, as good as they are at memorizing, and they could be very, very good at memorizing the Quran, this is the reason why we would never rely on oral tradition. It's not a very reliable method. If we take those 10 people and then we get them to write the Quran out a year later or whatever, months later, based on what they've memorized, and then we compare them, I bet you £1 million they will be different. They will be, oh, I thought it was this, I thought it was this. You will have human error involved, and we as people that memorize Quran or memorize words or memorizing big, long books, word for word, it's a very poor method. So the best method is to write it down early. Once you've got it written down, you make copies of it. So the fact that I think what's clearly happened here, to be the best possible explanation, is they were poor for whatever reason, whether it's resources, a lack of availability of parchments, whatever it may be. They simply, or combination of that and a lot of people dying and copies being lost or whatever the reason, they seem to take their time about getting it written down. And there may have been reasons, valid reasons, why they didn't get it written down quick enough or early enough, allowed this whole oral tradition to last a bit too long, in my view. That then when these individuals then went their different ways and then they started to write down what they had memorized, they realized they were missing certain bits, they forgot certain bits, and therefore you would get definitely variations, because relying on memorization is a very poor method. So this would make sense to see variations. So why don't they just admit there are variations, human errors involved, and of course, that's a result. And that's what we see. These variances can only be resulting on human error, human input. And that's why the perfect preservation in the Quran, or the claim of the Quran, simply cannot be true, because there was no protection. Human error did prevail. We did see the differences between one person recording it versus another person recording it. Of course, these people have dispersed, they're in different lands, they're not comparing with each other what they're writing. So lo and behold, when we see the formulation, that's why Uthman made such a big effort to standardize, because there were so many variations. That's part of the evidence. Again, variances prove that the quality of the preservation was not as good as they thought. So that's what I thought. I'd add that to what you said there, brother.
Yeah, I agree with you, sir. And I think the purpose for burning the Quran at first by Uthman was actually the effort was actually in vain, because if you burn down the Quran and then because you want to have a kind of a one Quran at the end of the day, but later after you are gone, we began to see different Qurans springing up. So it means that burning the rest manuscripts that you burnt down, you don't actually need them, because we still till date we still have different Qurans. So the citation of Uthman actually does not solve anything. It all boils down for the fact that memorization is not the perfect form of preservation. As a matter of fact, if Uthman had allowed those Quranic copies to still be in existence, probably, probably Muslims would be able to say the way we Christians can say that we can say for sure that we are getting back to the autograph of the Bible based on the enormous manuscript evidence we have. Probably Muslims can do that. But sadly, Uthman had burned down those manuscripts. They do not have it. We do not have any of Uthmanic manuscripts. There is no way Muslims can go back to the Uthmanic or the Muhammad kind of Quran any longer. So Muslims are in jeopardy and in a big dilemma which they cannot solve. So would you can take it over.
Beautiful. Okay, so as we hear, folks, everyone they see a lot based on the Quranic manuscripts. Now, even when you type in the sources of the history, the scholars, early scholars, whether or not the scriptures are preserved, then you have to prove it and show us where does it links back to word for word and dot for dot. Even your own, the own hadith, own sources prove that it cannot be perfectly preserved but have some variant. Okay, so thank you again, Brother Ray, for joining. And for those who doesn't know Ray, that has a YouTube channel called Ray for Truth Ministries. You can check him out there. And somehow he plays in great content, refuting atheism, refuting Muslims, and also giving evidence for the resurrection. So give me a sec. And then you can subscribe from there. Uh, and then of course you'll be able to learn more. Okay. So, Brother Ray, any last word would you like to add to finish off?
Yeah, just to say, for certainly for those Muslims out there, we are trying to be open and honest. These are information that's based on your sources, Islamic sources, based on a scholarly work, clearly proving there are variances. Even today, when you pick up Qurans of different countries and you read the Arabic, they are different Arabic words in many of the verses, proving this pure, perfect preservation is simply a myth.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, and I will says thank you again for joining. For those who came to watch, uh, truth is not subjective. Brother Adam, thank you for joining. Ben Bass, the one who usually come often is Sama Apologetics. Sorry if I say it wrong, from South Africa. So to my brother, Eating Apologetics, Christian Apologetics Network, Ready to Reasons, Johnny Apologetics, and Ready for Truth, we said thanks for joining and hope you have a great evening and see you all next week.
Take care. Bye bye.